Hello, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Scholars Hub at Home. I'm Julie Lafford. I'm the Assistant Vice President for Alumni Engagement here at York University. Thanks for joining today's session, The Trump Regime's Predatory Imperial Moves. Very timely topic indeed. Before we get started, I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge the land that York University campuses are located on. Because we're not all gathered in the same place, the land I'm about to acknowledge might not be the territory that you are on, so please take the responsibility to acknowledge the traditional territory you're on. As a member of the York University community, I recognize that many Indigenous nations have longstanding relationships with the territories upon which York University campuses are located that precede the establishment of the university. York University acknowledges its presence on the traditional territory of many Indigenous nations. The area known as Takaronto has been caretaken by the Anishinaabe Nation, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and the Huron-Wendat. It is now home to many First Nations, Inuit, and Métis communities. We acknowledge the current treaty holders, the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. This territory is subject to the Dish with One Spoon Swamp Belt Covenant, an agreement to peaceably share and care for the Great Lakes region. Now, as we usually do with Scholars Hub, we want to take a quick poll before the session begins. Today's question is, how would you rate your knowledge regarding the topic of today's presentation? So the poll should be on your screen now, and I'll just give you a moment to respond. Thank you. Your response is helpful for our speakers to know more about our audience. If you need help with the Zoom webinar, feel free to click on the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen and enter your question. Our team is in the background working and ready to help you. The same button can be used to submit questions for our guest speaker to answer during the Q&A period. Feel free to add those questions anytime during the lecture. Please note that all your questions and comments are visible to our panelists and staff working behind the scenes. We ask that you keep your comments relevant and respectful. Now I'd like to introduce our speaker this afternoon, Professor Ilan Kapoor. Ilan Kapoor is a professor of critical development studies at the Faculty of Environmental and Urban Change. He teaches global environmental politics and international development studies from a critical perspective. His research centers on the politicization of global development, showing how it's contested from the perspective of class, gender, racialization, indigeneity, and opening it up to debate. Welcome, Professor Kapoor. Glad to have you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Julie, for your invitation, for your kind words, and many thanks to the alumni engagement team, especially Jenny Evans, Udena, and others for all your efforts, and once again for this invitation to speak. And thanks to our audience for being here.
My pleasure. I'll hand things over to you now. You can share your screen and take it from here. Thank you.
Thanks. I look forward to the comments and questions of the audience during the Q&A. So just to point out to the audience that in the Zoom chat, we've put an outline of my talk in order to help you get a sense of the structure of my argument. But let me begin by saying that there's been so much turbulence from Trump and his regime during the short span of 2.5 months since it came to power, including yesterday with the so-called Liberation Day tariffs. I obviously coordinated with Donald and his team to do this talk the day after. In any case, it's hard to believe that it's only been 2.5 months. It already feels like an eternity. But because of that, I think it's easy to forget that when Trump first mused about that Canada should become the US's 51st state in December of last year, Dominique LeBlanc, then Trudeau's finance minister, declared that Trump's remark was just a quip. To quote him, he said, "The president was telling jokes. The president was teasing us. It was, of course, in no way a serious comment." And then the same kind of incredulity was expressed by political leaders across the world when a few weeks later, Trump talked about acquiring Greenland and the Panama Canal to strengthen US national security, using economic force to make Canada the 51st state, refusing to rule out military force to take control of Greenland and the Panama Canal, and then taking over Gaza. But now that the president has actually carried through on his likely crippling trade threats, launching an all-out trade war with the world, especially from yesterday. The highest tariffs, by the way, are on the economically most poor countries in the world, like Laos and Lesotho. We shouldn't forget. Now that that has happened, the US imperialist expansionism is in plain sight. Canadians have, of course, come to realize that Trump's tariff-driven assault by economic force may not be a temporary or a minor irritant, but rather an attack on Canadian sovereignty itself. So our whole federal election is now centered on that existential threat. So I suppose the joke is on all of us for not initially, at least, taking Trump's early musings seriously, even when all the signs of his imperialist designs have been staring us in the face, especially during his election campaign. It's reminiscent, I think, of British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain's incredulity in 1938 that Hitler would actually risk world war, despite Hitler's aggressive rhetoric, incorporation of Austria into the Reich, the Anschluss, and threats to Czechoslovakia and Poland during that time. So then what have been the signs of these expansionist tendencies of the Trump regime? Now, of course, the US's economic and military might, even though declining today relative to the rise of the emerging powers such as China, India, Brazil, and so on and so forth, it still provides a very solid basis for the projection of US supremacy. But I think there are also two new elements, important elements. So the first is the decidedly corporate stamp of the Trump regime, which appears to treat the nation as a business corporation. As we know, Trump has stacked his administration with not just private sector leaders, but corporate billionaires. That makes a difference. Elon Musk, Doug Burgum, Howard Lutnick, and others. And just like other billionaires of our time, these men, and they are pretty well all men, spectacular business success is founded and has been shown to be founded by research, not on mainstream competitive market practice like efficiency, productivity, cost cutting, but on predatory and what some have called cannibalistic practices. So, for example, controlling resources, oil, gold, diamonds, coltan, to firmly secure production inputs, squeezing or buying out competitors to monopolize markets and patents, and deliberately breaking up and destroying companies for quick economic gain. That's the business practice, as you may know, of mergers and acquisition, with little regard for the resulting job losses or employment insecurity. So I think it's in this light that Trump's outward statements about buying Greenland and Gaza, annexing Canada, capturing the Panama Canal, and forcing a minerals deal on Ukraine, that is, merging and acquiring them, I think it's in that light that it needs to be seen. Under the guise of national security, the idea is not simply to safeguard America's borders, but to engage in economic expansionism and real estate development, aided maybe by the US's military might where needed. That is to take control of the land, the waterways, the mineral wealth from oil and gas to cobalt that are seen as critical to building what Trump has called the golden age of US corporate capitalism. As one Trump advisor put it a few days ago in relation to Greenland, quote, there could be trillions of dollars worth of minerals and oil and gas and other types of precious metals that could be of value to the United States, end of quote. The trouble with this kind of naked, rapacious way of putting it is that it's only a short hop to seeing the Greenlandic people as an obstacle. And I should point out that this means in this case, in Greenland's case, indigenous Inuit people, uh, which is no minor detail. And that in light of Denmark's already poor record of colonialism and racism in Greenland. So the approach here seems to be mainly a business one with little concern for the social and indeed environmental costs produced by these imperial ventures. I'm talking about recession, unemployment, violence, forced displacement in Gaza, for example, human suffering, carbon pollution, and so on and so forth. This is very much in line with Trump's infamous book, we shouldn't forget, The Art of the Deal, where the other, the foreign other, or the US national other, is seen strictly as competitor or object, to be callously bullied, degraded, manipulated, exploited, and finally vanquished. So to the extent that people do enter the frame, it's mainly as human resources required to service US economic and business elites. So as sweatshop laborers, mainly in the global south, or precarious and part-time workers. And I think it is this cheap and exploited labor that we shouldn't forget that has enabled the massive wealth accumulation of the giant corporations represented by the likes of Trump and Burgum and Musk. In the case of the Ukraine deal, I should point out, President Zelensky is being pressured into prioritizing a minerals deal, as you may know. That seems to me a clear case of extortion by the Trump regime. You get our help if you pay for it by allowing the US to exploit your natural resources for decades to come. And this is even more obscene, I would say, when we combine it with Trump and Vance's demands for gratitude during that infamous White House meeting in February. Yeah, Ukraine must not only say thank you for help, but then it must also pay for it. The second sign of the Trump regime's imperial proclivities lies in the populist nationalism that, again, we must not forget has brought this president and his regime to power for the second time, right? Trump 2.0, as they say. Yeah. As my recent research on psychoanalysis shows, Trump's populism has successfully plumbed, has successfully captured the general mood of anxiety and instability of Americans. Job insecurity, food price rises, housing crisis, many of the same things here in Canada. The idea is to promise to resolve all of these crises by making America great again, MAGA. What MAGA does is soothe people's worries by unifying them, imploring and encouraging them to take patriotic pride in recreating some past, some mythical American past. But just like other right-wing populisms around the globe, and I'm thinking here of Erdogan's Turkey or Orban's Hungary or Modi's India, Trump's MAGA movement has sought to unify the nation by targeting national enemies, illegal migrants, trans people, and in this case, the country's largest trading rivals, Mexico, Canada, and China. Also, the construction of villains, especially those seen as contributing to America's economic decline. What that does is whip up national sentiment in the form of suspicion, envy, fear, aggression, vengeance. And the result is an emotionally charged and divisive nationalist discourse that cannot be reasoned with. There's no reasoning here with this regime. One is either inside or outside. One is either with us or against us, a believer or a woke liberal. So Trump's populism is built on irrational, if not dangerous sentiment. So this combination of US global power, nationalist populism, and the corporate predatory inclinations of the current US administration, I think that makes for a potentially lethal setup. It provides the ingredients and the fuel for a muscular economic expansionism. the beginnings of which we have now begun to manifest itself. So the thought was that the Trump regime was protectionist and isolationist, right? That's what America first means. But now I think it emerges as something more troubling, something more dangerous and nefarious, right? A government intent on securing America's industrial base through tariffs and trade wars, while at the same time expanding this base through this hawkishness, mainly economic imperialism, land grabs, water grabs, if you like. There's an undoubted ruthlessness about all of this, including an apparent willingness to bring not just the US so-called enemies, but also its friends to their knees, if needs be. So America first now appears more like America above all others. And I say that given all the Hitlerian connotation, right? Deutschland über alles. That is, realize its greatness by bullying its rivals into subordination. Finally, the last part of my talk. It must be said, though, that a lot can stand in the way of this aggressive expansionism. Yeah, the imperial ingredients are there and have begun to be deployed, but that doesn't mean that they will come to fruition or be successful. I think there's an unmistakable chaos and unpredictability and empty theatricality to the Trump administration's policymaking, which I would argue is part and parcel of the irrationality of MAGA populism, as I just talked about. So this means that while there may be small or temporary successes, several of the imperial moves are likely to unravel in the longer term. As one commentator recently put it, Trump is sort of an instant gratification president. He doesn't have the patience to do the work that diplomacy requires. And the result is that he overpromises and underdelivers. Yeah, the bombast, the arrogance of his regime's populism is not as strong as it pretends to be. Often, once again, because it is irrational, it's overly emotional, it's not thought through properly. So, for example, as we know, he's walked back on some of the tariffs threats to Canada and other countries, at least in part due to the stock market slumps and pushback from corporate leaders. On Gaza, while he earlier suggested Palestinians should be evicted from Gaza and the territory turned into some giant real estate development, the Riviera of the Middle East, as he called it, he has since dialed that down. So some things have already not gone the way he intended. And then there's all the stuff that's happening in reaction to as a consequence of his regime's moves. So, for example, we know Canadian trade retaliation combined with the countermeasures by China, Mexico, the EU in a few days. All of this could sorely backfire on the Trump administration by causing hardship to US companies and consumers, higher food and energy prices, layoffs in the auto and agricultural sectors. And this will give way to a popular backlash, especially as several of the countermeasures, China and Canada, for example, are targeted towards the red states where Trump derives much of his political support. A US economic downturn would, as we know, in turn yield to further global stock market instability and plummeting stock prices, negatively affecting Trump's own economic and business elite backers. And we are already seeing this with the global stock market declines in the last few days, including of Tesla, by the way. As well, new economic and military alliances have now begun to form between Trump's so-called enemies or adversaries to challenge US attempts at global supremacy. Canada seeking new trade relationships with Europe, with India, with China, the EU rallying to counter Russia with a military alliance, a stronger military alliance, or the fact that US protectionism and expansionism may cause a portion of the corporate world not to invest, but to disinvest from the US, contrary to what Trump thinks, in favor of more stable and welcoming climates elsewhere in the world. And so there may even be capital flight to Canada and to China, as some are suggesting. So to conclude, let me circle back to where I started about people initially thinking that the Trump regime's threats, including making Canada a 51st state, was a joke. We thought the sheer bombast and arrogance of them could not possibly be serious. And then he proved us wrong by actually carrying through on some of them, at least. But now, we're not so sure because he has also backtracked, and it looks like several of his moves will backfire. So maybe our initial thought that they might be a joke is not so wrong after all. And that's once again because the Trump regime's populist nationalism is built on this irrational bombast and arrogance, which is both its strength and its weakness. There's an excess to it that means that it overreaches, overpromises, overcommits. It thus, as it hoists on its own petard, as they say. It becomes victim to its own bombast. The big problem, though, is that in the meantime, people are threatened, lose their jobs, and are at risk of being evicted from their land and so forth, including in the US itself. So we cannot ignore the human costs of Trump's imperial moves, even if they are likely to stumble and falter. Thanks for your attention.
Professor Kapoor, thank you so much for that talk. It was fascinating, and I actually was sitting here just jotting down like more questions I have about Trump's endgame and the manipulation of markets, things outside your expertise. So I'm not gonna try, but I'm sure the audience has lots of great questions for you as well. So folks in the audience, please feel free to use that Q&A and post your questions there. And I already have a question for you, Professor Kapoor. It's from Allison. I have concerns that both Quebec and Alberta, for quite different reasons, are not as aligned with the rest of Canada. Could Trump take advantage of this by offering specific deals for those provinces when it comes to taking over Canada? Perhaps offering something to satisfy the separatists in Quebec and MAGA faction in Alberta. Allison also notes she has a very fond feeling for the culture of both provinces and many people I know there.
Yeah, great question. I mean, that is Trump's modus operandi, isn't it? That divide and rule, and it's not just Trump. That is the old imperial agenda. You divide and rule, and you conquer better that way. I think it's possible. Yeah, there's already signs of that. So as we know, the latest threats coming from the US administration involve questioning supply management in Canada. So that's definitely a big problem. And Carney has said that's off the table, but we'll see where it goes. And Quebec especially, the language laws are seen as a non-tariff barrier. So that's going to be a big issue, and it's already been brought up by various parties on that. Yeah, so, and the Alberta Premier has, I mean, some say at least, has fed into that, right, by going and talking to right-wing podcast hosts and so on and so forth in the States, and has gotten into a bit of trouble as a result of that. So there is that. But I mean, at the moment, it seems that, Doug Ford, who has emerged as the kind of Mr. Canada, the banner of Mr. Canada almost, still that approach still seems to hold, right? I think there's a measured response here from the Canadian premiers up to now. Many things could change. And there's a recognition that they need to hold together, that one province shouldn't suffer as a result of the countermeasures more than others. But there are the rumblings of, possible division. We'll see. It's hard to put. It also depends on how hard the Trump regime pushes its agenda and pushes its divide and rule policy. So, I mean, I don't really have an answer, but yeah, all the elements are there for both the Canadian strategy to hold together despite everything, and that it may unravel a bit because if Trump pushes the right levers. So we'll see.
Thank you for that. Given your analysis, what should Canada's response be to the Trump regime to protect ourselves and our sovereignty?
Right. Yeah, so bear with me. I have a few things to say on this. I think there are two angles. The first is the psychoanalytic angle that comes out of my work. I think the mistake of the Trudeau government was to be too quick and keen to react to Trump's threats, because I think they ended up trying to appease him. And the last thing you do to a bully is appease the bully, which had the effect not of placating him and his regime, but on the contrary, I think these efforts were taken as evidence that more bullying is in order and further concessions can be extracted, right? And that's evident, I think, in the continuing prospect of tariffs and the possibility of more to come afterwards, including on lumber, on dairy, and so on and so forth. And I think we can contrast the Trudeau government's almost panicked reaction to Trump's threats and jokes versus Mexico's reaction. I think that's something very instructive, because Claudia Sheinbaum, the president of Mexico, has not flinched, has not tried to appease Trump from the very beginning in the way that Trudeau seems to have, at least in some sense. And I think that's revealing of a more principled, a calmer approach to dealing with Trump. So she has chatted with Trump over the phone, but not rushed to meet him, not rushed to go to Mar-a-Lago to meet him, as Trudeau did. She's held her cards closer to her chest without giving the strategy away or playing into Trump's games. And I think Mark Carney is doing that too now. Maybe he's learned from Scheinbaum, I don't know, but I mean, that's also part of who he is. He is calmer, which is why Canadians are more in favor of him than the others, it seems. But he too has not been at Trump's beck and call. In fact, Trump asked to speak to him last week, not the other way around. So not trying to appease Trump, not trying to cater him. I think that's probably the best way psychoanalytically to respond to this aggressive populism. A more tough and principled stand and a more wait and see stand. But that's the psychic angle. So just bear with me. One more point. The political angle, I think, is to use this crisis as an opportunity. What the tariff war has done is to expose Canada's almost total dependence on trade with the US, but also expose our total dependence on extractive and resource industries, which some have called a staples economy. We have a relatively low manufacturing base and a very high mining and minerals base, oil and gas, hydro, potash, and steel and aluminum. So I would argue, yes, let's get rid of the internal trade barriers. Let's diversify our trade partnerships. That's what several of our leaders are saying. Let's de-link more from the US. But I'm for a much more progressive agenda than that. Let's also use this crisis to engage in fair trade, not free trade, build our economy along green lines, a much less carbon-reliant economy. That's a long-term strategy that we should be thinking seriously about, and rebuild by addressing the huge growing social and economic inequalities across Canada. Less dependence on part-time and poorly remunerated labor, on no more child poverty, no more Indigenous dispossession, and so forth. So I know this may sound like pie in the sky. It is, I agree. But this is the question. Why is it that those on the right, like Trump, can shoot for the impossible, the irrational, taking over Gaza and Greenland, imagine that, and Canada? Yet the left can't do the same. That is, fight for a green economy, fight for social justice. That's really something to ponder here, I think. Sorry for going on, but.
That was fascinating analysis. Thank you so much. The questions are pouring in, so I'm going to get to them. Rodrigo asks, there's a common tendency to characterize the Trump regime as fascist. In your opinion, is this a correct definition, or could we describe it as a natural evolution of neoliberal, economic and political model?
Great question.
Thanks.
Yeah, you're right. The term fascism is being thrown around a lot, but you know what? I actually think there's something to it. I mean, it all depends on how you define fascism. We should recall that Hitler's fascism was supported by uh, a whole a, a whole regime of based on racism, on ethnic cleansing. And there are, elements of that in the Trump regime. It is, in a way, the populist nationalism of Trump is also based on that. But more importantly, we shouldn't forget that one of the things that Hitler wanted to change the whole regime, but one of the things that he refused to do was to change the economic regime. He still stuck to a very market-based economy, and I think that's also the case here. So we should, the distance between fascism and neoliberalism, or at least the extreme neoliberalism that we're seeing now, is not so great. So I think there are some valid reasons to think about the fascist dimensions of the Trump regime here. I prefer the term. I've written about this. I think we're moving towards, or maybe we've already moved towards what I call a neo-feudalist global regime. And I say that because of the rise of these billionaires, and it's not just in America, it's happening in India, it's happening in Japan, in Korea, and so many, and Turkey, right? Pretty well all the places where populism is on the rise. And I think it's happening at the time when inequality in the world, spatial inequality, but also between social classes, is at record level. The inequality in India is worse now than it was during colonial times. It's a tragic thing to say. And what does that mean? Is that the gap between the very lowest on our economic social ladder and the highest is even greater. That's why we have more billionaires now than we've ever had. China has over 1,000 billionaires, for example. So I would argue that neo-feudalism, neo-feudal capitalism, if you want, whatever you want to call it, is also an appropriate term here.
That makes a lot of sense. I was thinking earlier about that these tariffs seemed aimed at decimating the middle class in America, because those are the people that are going to be paying the price, literally paying the price. Yeah. Anyway, back to the question.
And
Sorry
also,
about
sorry,
that.
and also, America, again, unprecedented inequality, and once again, the success of the Trump regime, we should give it its due. Unlike the Democrats, they have plumbed into that dissatisfaction, anxiety, and frustration successfully.
So I have a couple of questions about sort of how do we stop Trump? So I'm combining a couple of questions here. It seems like we have to rely on US citizens to bring an effective response against Trump. People are asking, where is this going to come from? One person in particular has asked about the judicial arm of government. Will they have enough power to stop his actions? Will Congress do it? So over to you for your thoughts on something really complicated.
Yeah, very complicated. Yeah, I think it's going to happen. If it's going to happen, it's going to happen. I think it will happen. As I said, I think the logic or the lack of logic of the Trump regime is going to backfire. It's inevitable. It's inevitable. I mean, there may be some successes along the way. Yeah, I think he will get the Ukraine deal, and I think there'll be some successes on the tariff front, but overall, I think it will backfire. So I don't think it's a question of if it will. I think it's when it will.
Mm,
And as I said, a lot of suffering will happen in between now and then. But yes, I think if it's going to if the the change is, if any serious change is going to happen, it has to happen from within the US more than anywhere else. Um, and I think there will be a backlash of some kind. We're already starting to see the rumblings of it, right? Yesterday, four Republicans sided with all the Democratic
mm,
senators and actually passed a bill censoring in the Senate that censors Trump. That's the first time that's happened yet. I mean, when it goes to the House, it's not going to. Of course, it's not even going to. I think it's not even going to be considered in the House. But still, it's a symbol. It's the beginnings, I think.
mm,
Certainly, all the governors of the states that border with Canada, both Republican and Democrat, are up in arms against what's just happened. So it's beginning, and I think it will hit, but it will only happen from the bottom. The Republicans in the House and in the Senate are so on side with Trump for political reasons, right? They're very scared of the MAGA base and their re-election, that it's going to have to happen through sheer frustration from the bottom. Um, Food prices, energy prices, and so on. So I think
mm.
that's the main place it's going to happen. I think it's not clear to me that globally much can happen. New alliances will form, of course, but I'm not sure they will be as effective as an internal an internal set of pushback.
And the judicial arm, did you want to address that piece?
Yeah. Sorry, and what's the dimension of the judicial, just so that I get the question right?
Oh, will they have the, sorry, let me go back to the question. Do they have enough power to stop
Mm.
Trump's actions?
Um, yeah, again, I think it's a contradictory process from my knowledge of the U.S. Judicial process. I mean, I think, as we know, when things go all the way up to the Supreme Court, there are pretty good chances, given that he stacked it in his favor, that it's going to
Mm,
go in his favor. But I think the judicial system, the Supreme Court is much more politicized. I mean, the whole system is politicized, but
mm,
the Supreme Court is much more politicized than the rest of the judicial system. And I think there's more chance of various breaks, of various cases being brought against Trump, at the lower state and district levels than there are at the Supreme Court. So again, I think it's going to be a contradictory process, but I'm no expert on this, but I don't think the pushback is going to come so much from the judicial sector. I think it's going to come from the bottom up process that I just talked about. That's
interesting. Thank
Yes,
you for that. It would be interesting to have one of our legal scholars on to
I
address that,
agree.
actually. Yeah.
Agree.
Um, Another question is, perhaps outside your area of expertise, but perhaps also directly related to it, which is what are your thoughts on Trump's attack on higher education in the US and the danger, like personal and professional and sometimes physical danger that some academics are feeling right now?
Yeah, no, and this is, I mean, it's not just there, it's happening here too, I would
Mm,
argue in many ways. I mean, the MAGA movement is not as strong here as it is there, but Alberta, we've already seen signs
yeah.
of it. There's at least one university in Alberta that has uh, softened the name of its DEI programs. So it's also close to home, because the Alberta government has been quite MAGA on that topic, on the whole DEI agenda, the equity agenda. Again, this has been in the making for a while. The Florida has already gone through a massive um, realignment of university funding and so on and so forth. The governor of Florida has really attacked universities, especially all those that are funded by the state, and pretty well stacked. I mean, I have personal friends who have been let go from various universities in Florida for doing work on anti-racism and any kind of equity agenda, and they pretty well stacked. Because they provide funding to universities and liberal arts colleges, they stack the boards of governors of these institutions so that they get their way. So it's already been happening over the last 5, 6 years, and now, of course, it's happening at the federal level. Yeah, so it is disturbing, uh, and of course the anti uh, Israel state politics or the Israel-Palestine politics as being used as an excuse. It's another way of once again attacking various universities. So I think much will
Mhm.
depend on how universities, if they push back. A lot of them are privately endowed. Certainly but even those have been kind of cowering in front of the Trump regime. So at the moment, it's not looking good, but I mean, the good news is that there nonetheless remains quite a substantial student movement um, across
Mm,
the states that is willing to stand up. The administrations of universities are less willing, but the student movement is willing to stand up. And I think, if we're going to have any faith in some resistance, it's going to be from there, not from the faculty as much as the student body.
nice. Thank you. So that concludes our Q&A session. But before I wrap up, Professor Kapoor, I just wanted to offer you an opportunity for any last words, words of encouragement, words of hope, advice, all is welcome.
I mean, my words of hope is that that no matter how bad the crisis is always an opportunity as well, and that's where we need to take hope. Um, so this is yet another series of crisis, and so it can go this way and it can go that way, but let's hope it goes in, from my point of view, in a more progressive way. But that's the challenge for all of us, I think, is pushing it in that direction. But other than that, thank you so much for once again for inviting me. And the questions were
Sure.
wonderful. Thank you so much to the audience for these questions. Lots of food for thought.
It's
Keep
such a
strong.
pleasure to have you today. Thank you so,
Thank
so
you so
much
much,
for
Julie.
taking the time. All right, you're welcome to turn your video off now. So a recording of this video will be posted on our YouTube channel. A colleague of mine is going to post that link in the chat. And I have, before you go, one more poll question for the audience. How would you rate your knowledge of today's topic following this discussion? So go ahead and answer that when it pops up on your screen. So please join us for our next Scholars Hub on Wednesday, April 9th with Dr. Sahil Singh. He's the assistant professor at the School of Kinesiology and Health Sciences, Faculty of Health, and his discussion is titled, Is Race a Social Determinant of Health? To register for these events and learn about upcoming sessions, you can visit yorku.ca/alumni and friends. Thank you all so much for your time today. I hope you enjoyed the discussion as much as I did. Be well.